don't know how a lot of these YouTubers do it. You know, like they will, you know, ramble off about something that when they were 6 years old they remembered playing, I don't know, something on their Amstrad CPC or Commodore 64 or whatever it might be. I'm like, I can't remember what happened 2 years ago sometimes. My memory isn't as good as what some people's are, I guess. But anyway, I've been racking my brains about this because this year is the 35th anniversary of the Game Boy. It was first released in 1989 in Japan and the North American region. I assume that included Canada and that kind of thing. But yeah, for me, the Game Boy was the very first game system that I actually paid any attention to, because up until that point, I don't think video games of any description figured into my life at all. It wasn't until the age of 8, and I will get on to that, that I got my first gaming system. So, and that was, as I would tell you and how I worked it out, 1991. So, me and the Game Boy. When the Game Boy came out in Europe, it was 1990. So in 1989, it wasn't even available. And besides, I would have been about 6 years old at the time. And so at that time, we had, as a family, had just moved from one end of the country to the other. And so I didn't really have that many friends, but I'd started to make new friends at my new school. And one of my closest friends was a girl called Rachel, and we used to hang out all the time. She would come over to my house and I would go over to hers. You know, we'd watch VHS tapes, water babies on TV, this kind of stuff. And we'd also enjoy buttboarding on our skateboards down the slope, the road that was outside of her house, Arlington Terrace. Absolutely potholed to smithereens it was, because it was one of those like unadopted roads where the local authority, the council, hadn't actually taken on responsibility for the road. It had remained basically the responsibility of the people who lived along the street. And so the top end of the road was so rutted with potholes and all the rest of it that basically the only reason that you would ever skate down that thing is, one, if you had a death wish, or two, you wanted to get the cover of Thrasher. So we was quite happy buttboarding on our skateboards down there. But anyway, so yeah. I later realised after a few years that her older brother had a Commodore 64. Now, I had no idea really what it was until I got a Commodore 64 of my own, because I thought, well, that looks completely different to mine. And then I connected it a little bit later on that my cousins, who still lived in the London direction where we had moved from, gave us or gifted us their old Commodore 64, which came in like the bread bin case. So that's why I was just like, so Rachel's older brother has like the older Commodore 64. So the Game Boy was something that I think first came into my life in around about late 1990. In the UK, most schools have to have school uniform, and usually on the very last day of term, it's like a non-uniform day. The end of semester, you can wear your own clothes, and you was encouraged to bring in a toy or a board game or something like that which you could share with friends and play. And one of the kids in my class, he brought in his brand new Game Boy. He must have got it for his birthday, because this thing was just like, I had never seen anything like it in my life before, and neither had any of us, to be fair. And we was all mesmerised by this thing because it had amazing graphics. You could carry it around with you. It ran off of batteries. In fact, I want to make a point about that. So yeah, it ran off of batteries. In many ways, it reminded us of Walkmans or our personal stereos. I could never afford a Sony Walkman back in the day. I didn't even have one when I was a teenager, but as an adult, I have a Sony Walkman, which still gets used. But yeah, I think that's what really enraptured me about it, was that it reminded me of my little personal stereo that I had. And yeah, I just thought, this is amazing. It's got great sound, and even more impossibly, you could change the cartridges and put new games in, which sort of really elevated it above like your Systema 3 and Grandstand and Game & Watch style handhelds. Just a wonderful thing, and it was the first time that I really sat up and paid attention to video games. Before that, I don't think I ever recognised an arcade cabinet, a computer, a games console of any description, and I was 7 years old by this time, so I just guess my interests were in other things, as I sort of was talking about at the start of the video. So the Game Boy really got stuck in my imagination. And the following year, and I've been trying to piece together which year this was it 91 or 92? it was getting towards my birthday. My parents asked me, what would you like for your birthday? What are you interested in? And I remember asking them for a Game Boy. And they said to me, no, it's not possible because it's just too expensive and the games are like £20–25 a pop. So I was like, oh. So I did what any kid would do. I made my own Game Boy. And you might be wondering, well, how on earth does a young kid make a Game Boy? Well, the answer is really simple. You just use old cereal packets and sellotape and stuff like that. So I fashioned this sort of like little box, and I punched sort of basically 2 holes which you could push like a pencil into, like this. And I cut a little sort of aperture or sort of screen into the top of the box. And then cutting strips of, cutting paper into strips, which I glued or sellotaped end to end, I could make like a roll of paper, a bit like a register receipt roll or a till receipt roll. And then onto that paper I could draw like little puzzles, colouring exercises, word searches, quizzes, all this kind of stuff. And the idea is that you would spool this piece of paper up onto one of the pencils, so it always ends up like a scroll, and then attach the other end to the other pencil. And the idea was that you could scroll this sort of this roll through the this little shoebox thing, and you could do your puzzles and games in it. I seem to remember the problem was trying to get the paper threaded, because you had to push the pencils into the box first, then you'd have to sort of wind up the paper on one of the pencils and then try and sellotape the other end to the other pencil. And yeah, I don't think I ever really properly solved that. And the other issue was trying to get enough of a firm surface so that when you was writing on the top of, like where the paper was showing through the little aperture, I'd sort of screen that I had made in the top of the box, it was always sort of a bit flexible, because presumably I was backing it with another piece of like cornflake box, sort of cardboard. So, but anyway, I had this thing, and I must have been quite pleased with it. And I remember on TV about the same time there was an advert for the Eurythmics, which is very popular UK synth pop pop bands, made such bangers like Sweet Dreams and Here Comes the Rain Again.
Eurythmics' greatest hits. Out now.
All this kind of stuff, really awesome, and I love this kind of music. I didn't really know what it was at the time, but I was already clued into that sort of style of synth pop, new wave music. I mean, it was basically the soundtrack to my youth, amongst other types of music as well, such as my mum's liking of Roy Orbison and other older sort of rock and punk bands and stuff. So all good stuff. But anyway, this compilation album was advertised on TV, and I remember being like, oh, that's that music I really like. And of course, obviously, they said Eurythmics on it, and I was just like, oh, so that's what they're called. And my kid brain obviously took Eurythmics and thought, oh, every multi. And I remember calling this little, sort of Game Boy, inverted commas, that I made, the every multi. Like, it could do everything, or it was multi-purpose, or it's kid shit, you know what I mean. And so I made this every multi, and trying to figure out what year this was, because I've never really, up until this point, been able to pin down, was it 91 or 92 I got a Commodore 64. And I thought, well, let's go on to the fountain of all 100% fact-checked knowledge and the source of most YouTube video content, Wikipedia. And I went onto the Eurythmics page and looked at the discography, and it showed that in the UK that the compilation album was released in 1991. So it had to be 91, because after that I got the Commodore 64, and yeah, I've been racking my brains as to when I got that, because I know that I was buying Zap 64 around about that time, but I don't know if it was 91 or 92. I can only remember magazines from 92, but they would have been from around about April, and I would never have got a Commodore 64 other than for my birthday, and I definitely didn't get it for Christmas. So my assumption is that I got it for my birthday in 1991. Now, as to how I got a Commodore 64, I have no idea, because I never asked for one. It just was there on my birthday, on my bed. So there you go. So yeah, that pieces it together. The Game Boy was something I first encountered in late 1990, and then the following year was when I got a Commodore 64, and that obviously is the path that I went down with gaming for a few years, with the C64 and then the Amiga and then the Super Nintendo, and the rest, as they say, is history. But except for one small point, insofar as that I think the reason why the Game Boy really enraptured me was its portability, and that's something that I really want to talk about, how the Game Boy connects to my life here in Japan. And I think there's a reason why modern day gaming has not connected with me for almost 25 years until I bought a Switch. It's because like your PlayStation 2, your Xbox 360s and all the other generations of consoles we've had, you know, since the original PlayStation, they're not portable. You can't take them with you, and to be honest with you, by the time I turned 18 around about the year 2000 or so, my interests were in just going out in the evening, partying and getting drunk. That was basically my sort of teenage years kind of thing. And so playing sort of the Game Boy Advance or the Game Boy Color was just not something I was interested in. So it came back into my life a little bit later on, because the Switch, like the Game Boy before it, had really sort of clued into my sort of need to be able to take gaming on the go, because I travel a lot. Those of you who watch my channel or maybe watch my channel going forwards will know that I post quite a lot of videos about my travels in my minivan here in Japan. So being out and about is really important to me, and you know, if I finish for the day, I like nothing more than to kick back in the back of my minivan, all snuggled up in my sleeping bag, playing my games either on my Switch or Game Boy or Game Boy Advance, and nice cold Coca-Cola. It's nice. So that's why I think the Switch is the first console that really was like, yeah, that's what I want. I don't want a PS5. They're awesome, but the Switch is where I'm at, kind of thing. So on that note, let me move on to like, why did the Game Boy, you know, really capture my imagination in terms of portable gaming, and how does that connect with my life here in Japan? So as I was just talking about, the portability of the system is really what gets me. This is the Game Boy Pocket model, so it's a little bit smaller than the original so-called DMG, the more brick-shaped Game Boy. But this is really pretty much the epitome of a great time as far as I'm concerned. I love the fact that with the updated screens I can easily see it these days. The non-backlit screens are just a little bit too hard on my ageing eyes, unfortunately. And the fact that I can just use AA or AAA batteries either in the Game Boy Color that I've got here, or my GBA, or the AAAs in the Pocket models, means that even if I run out of battery, say I can't charge my Eneloop rechargeables, I can go into any store and get a replacement set of batteries and be up and running again for a few days until I can either charge the batteries or, you know, I return home or something like that. So I think that aspect of it really keys in very well. And as I say, the games are incredibly compact, so I can take quite a few games with me when I go travelling, and it doesn't take up much room. Very much like the Switch does. You know, like with its very small cartridges, you can just have a carry case and you can have an absolutely enormous library on the go with you, but how you would ever play all that stuff on the go is another matter. So the Game Boy really speaks to me because of that portability factor. In fact, one of the very earliest videos that I made on this channel was all about my love of handheld gaming. So that's why the Game Boy, along with the Super Famicom or Super Nintendo, remains basically either my number one or number two pick for all-time favourite gaming system. And yes, that does very much clue into my love of the personal stereo as well. Same kind of form factor. I mean, the later Game Boy Pocket model is almost identical to this late 1980s Sony Walkman, WM203, I think it is. WMF203. Yeah, so I think that aspect of it really appeals to me. And the fact that you can put your headphones in and not disturb people, you've got link-up gameplay, means that it's still very relevant these days. A couple of years ago I was back in the UK for my brother's wedding, and I visited a really good friend of mine, Tim, and we played plenty of games that day, but I think one of my favourite memories of that day was he had a GameCube with a Game Boy player, and I had my Game Boy, which I brought with me. We had two-player link-up Tetris, and it was just so much fun. So I think the simple experiences are sometimes, you know, still extremely enjoyable. And I love the fact that I can have this in my pocket and, you know, maybe I'm waiting to sit down at Sushiro or one of the Kaiten Sushi places, waiting for my number to be called, and I can bust the Game Boy out and have 3 or 4 minutes of gameplay, or longer if the queue is really bad, and just have a great deal of fun. So I think that aspect of it really speaks to me, and this really does clue into my experience of living in Japan. The fact that when I go travelling in my minivan that I have the choice of the Switch or the Game Boy is just really wonderful. But I think my appreciation of the Game Boy in Japan goes even deeper than that. One way that this does so physically is that I don't buy boxed Game Boy games. I don't usually buy boxed Game Boy games. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have a couple of others. They're the Pokemon Silver and Gold boxed games, which I scored for an amazing price about 4 years ago here. But the reason why I pick up these very early releases is, one, they're generally quite cheap, but two, the boxes are just so cute. They're wonderful. But even more importantly than that, I feel that some of these early games really epitomise the core Game Boy experience, which really came from Gunpei Yokoi, so-called, father of the Game Boy. He was very much the brainchild of the Game & Watch that came before the Game Boy in the early 80s. And so his idea of something that had endless playability was something that really was infused in the early DNA of Game Boy gaming. And so titles like this generally don't get completed. I mean, sure, you can complete a round of golf. Yes, you can, beat the AI or the computer mahjong opponent. But the point is that you can keep coming back to these titles and still get endless entertainment out of them. From the endless players like Tetris and Dr. Mario, beating your best score in golf, or beating one of the tougher opponents in tennis, or the real brain-teasing challenge of playing mahjong, which is the Yakuman box that's there. Is something that really epitomises this. Like, you will never ever get bored of these games. I certainly can't. Maybe you would with mahjong. Maybe mahjong's not your thing, but I'm one of those weirdos that likes mahjong. I'm not very good at it, but I do enjoy it, and I can sometimes beat the computer on it. But getting the right hands to be able to go out in Japanese style, so-called Riichi mahjong, is not easy, remembering all of the combinations that you can actually declare yourself basically as the winner of that particular round. So, but anyway, I'm not going to get into mahjong games in this particular video, but they really epitomise that endless enjoyment factor of it. There is such an amount of joy in that, and that's why these games, games that I've bought boxed, as opposed to, say, buying something like the Tiny Toon Adventures game, Babs's Big Break, as I think it was called, outside of Japan. It's a okay platformer for the system from Konami. I mean, when I say okay, it's just straight down middle of the road okay. It's not bad, it's not amazing, it's just okay, it's good. But am I going to take that with me a lot of the time? No. I mean, it can be completed very quickly, like Super Mario Land, but once you've played it once, you've generally found everything there is about the game to be had out of it. And sure, I probably will play it again at some point, but it's not a game like Tetris or golf where you can be beating your best score or just trying to get a high score. It's a slightly different type of play, which became much more dominant on the Game Boy as its life went on. So these box games really represent that. Another aspect, before I talk about loose games, is that Japan is such a fascinating place to live in terms of the fact that there are so many exclusive Japan-only games released here, which sadly never saw the light of day outside of Japan. There's also a lot of crap that didn't make it outside of Japan, thankfully, but there you go. But from games like the roguelike Cavanoir from Konami, never released outside of Japan, 40 stages of really good, not too difficult roguelike action is just wonderful to play, and something that I will go back to every now and then. A good top-down racer in the vein of Super Sprint or Supercars on the ST and the Amiga. Really nice top-down racer. It actually supports link-up play, but I've only got the one cartridge. But really one of the top-notch racing games on the Game Boy. Again, not released outside of Japan. Seiken Densetsu, the first Secret of Mana game. This was released outside of Japan as Final Fantasy Adventure or Mystic Quest in Europe. I mean, for God's sake, Square, get your act together. I mean, anyway, really good ARPG. Was released outside of Japan, as I say, that one. Mini Putt, a crazy golf game. Again, I don't believe this was released outside of Japan. A lot of fun. And also, as I referred to a moment ago, Yakuman, the mahjong game that was only released in Japan as a launch game for the Game Boy, which I really enjoy. So discovering a library of really interesting titles that just weren't released outside of Japan is part of the joy as well. And the other joy of that is that quite often, because of the pricing of loose cartridges, which I'll go on about in a moment, means that I can afford to take a punt sometimes, and sometimes, yeah, I find something that's very mediocre. Sometimes I find something that is like, wow, nobody has talked about this, and it's fantastic. And there's sometimes some information about games on this on Japanese, inverted commas, YouTube. But in terms of English speaking, well, there's very little out there. I mean, these pics here are ones that people have talked about on YouTube in English. For example, Cavanoir and Roadster have been talked about on other channels, one of which I've linked in the video description. But others, just completely unknown. So I'm going to be able to talk about those in my new gaming channel, Saki Endo's Rubbish Heap, which you can subscribe to in the links below, so in the description. First video is coming in June, which is going to be exciting. So discovering sort of these sort of quirky little gems is, I hate that word.
Spriggan powered. Yes.
Oh. Yeah.
But these quirky little unremarked games, even if they're just like okay, it's just like, wow, I found something that I enjoy. It's just so much fun. So how do I buy my Game Boy games in the main then? Well, obviously I buy them loose. So here's a trading card box. Trading cards, or trade car as they are over here, is extremely popular in Japan. So in the 100 yen stores, Daiso, Seria, basically like $1 or a pound shop, you can buy these trading card boxes which fit Game Boy loose games really well for, well, your aforementioned 100 yen plus tax. So I've got about 5 or 6 of these boxes, which is a bit crazy when you think about it, but there you go. And what I've got inside are these little trading card dividers that I've slightly cut to fit into the trading card box because they're slightly too tall by default. But that helps me keep them organised. And the way that I've organised these is not by using the Japanese Goju system, which is the phonetic Japanese orthography, so the 50 sounds of Japanese, you know, your ayu or sashi suseso kakiku keko stuff. So I've done this by 0 to 9 and then the alphabet A through to Z. So, well, should I say Z, seeing as I'm British, but unfortunately my force of habit of teaching American English where possible here in Japan has rubbed off on me. So Z, Z, whatever. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, sometimes the Japanese title of a game can be different to what I remember it as, and so I go looking for it under its like English name and I can't find it. So sometimes it's better for me to keep it organised according to the alphabet. If anything, I've done this kind of a bit like using Romaji, which is how in school here in Japan the alphabet is somewhat taught to basically Romanise of sorts the Japanese language. So I've kind of used Romaji, not so much the alphabet if I'm honest. So I've also got non-Japanese games here, for example Balloon Kid, never sadly released over here in physical cartridge form. It was released very late on as a coloured version for the Game Boy Color on the Nintendo Power Service. You could go into a Lawson store with a Game Boy memory card, a bit like the Nintendo, the Super Nintendo service or Super Famicom service that was here, and write games from the kiosk in those stores.
今回ローソンのロッピーで書き換えるのは新作 RPG ファイアーエンブレムトラッキア776。
俺と一緒に書き換えたいそう、OK？
ローソン
But I've got European and maybe 1 or 2 North American released Game Boy games in here as well. So having this by the Japanese, you know, Goju system doesn't make sense for those because they're obviously not written in Japanese. So that's how I organise them. So, you know, I've got B for Balloon Kid, not Ba, or I've not tried translating it into Japanese like Fusen Kodomo or something like that, Fusen being the Japanese word for balloon. So, because that would just be ridiculous, me translating all of these titles into Japanese, basically what I'm saying there. So yeah, so that's how I organise them, and it just makes it very easy for me to find games I'm looking for, like for example Daiko no Gensan. That's a fantastic platform. That's actually the second one. The first one, which you're probably more familiar with, was released in Europe as, sorry I'm just organising this, as Hammering Harry. That's the original one. Here in Japan, Daiko no Gensan. Like I say, I've got some European release ones here, or non-Japanese one, Dark Queen Duck there. But yeah, this way of organising my games makes a lot of sense, and it keeps my collection nice and compact. I don't like mess, and so when I see some ways in which things are organised, shall we say, in YouTube videos, it actually gives me the fear. So I like the fact that everything can be nice and compact and portable like that. So that's how I organise my loose games. So now let's talk about the last part of why the Game Boy really does add a lot to my life here in Japan, and the way that I'm going to explain this part is through this wonderful compendium that was, had a new edition that came out 1 month ago. So I'm going to talk about this book and also how the Game Boy gaming experience helps me with my studies of the Japanese language. So this here is the Game Boy Perfect Catalogue. It literally is called that in Japanese as well, Game Boy Perfecto Catalogue. So yeah, it's a wonderful new edition of this book, and the really amazing thing about this edition is not only does it cover all of the Japanese released Game Boy and Game Boy Color titles, but all of those released outside of Japan, and believe me, there are tons that were not released here. So this makes this pretty much the ultimate guide. Inside you've got this wonderful little pull out of basically the to scale photographs of the actual systems there. So for example, if I take my Game Boy Pocket, it's basically true to life size, so that's really cool. But on the other side, it includes all of the different color variations that were released of the various systems, including the Game Boy Light as well, which is really cool. So yeah, that's really quite a nice little pull out that's at the very front of the book. And then going into it, it has wonderful photography throughout. This is obviously the original DMG unit here, and then goes into all about the hardware itself, the Game Boy Hardware Dai Kenkyu, and so history as well as explaining the actual technology within it. And you can see here that we've got Game Boy Software all catalogue. So yeah, that's basically all the Japanese released titles, and then we've got the Game Boy Kaigai Software all catalogue, so basically the overseas library as well, which is really nice. So, and we've got this really useful index at the back which includes the Kaigai Game Boy Software title list, which is awesome. So I can basically cross-reference, like, I'm sure that game was released in Japan, oh no it wasn't, oh I'm sure this game was released in Europe, oh no it wasn't, kind of thing. And then afterwards we have the gold orange and listing as well, so for the Japanese titles, which is also very handy. I'm not going to go through every page of this book, but it goes into all about the history, the antecedents of the Game Boy, basically citing that the panoramic or the panorama screen Game & Watch was possibly the greatest influence on the initial Game Boy design, basically saying that you can't deny that sort of kind of influence, as well as covering some of the competition from the Lynx, the Game Gear and the PC Engine GT. And then it has some sort of comparison to the lifespan, and then it goes on to talk about every single different Game Boy model from the original, going into how it was the coming together of Sharp and Nintendo that really made the Game Boy what it is, as well as including some interesting of the period advertisements and some extremely deep dives into the hardware, the graphics, the sound hardware, the processor. So yeah, it compares this with the Famicom as well, the ROM cartridge format, even the batteries, the link cable, Shushin Porto is explained there. The controller, it also explains how that was influenced by the Famicom there, and then goes into the different sort of variations that then came out, including the list pricing at various different points in the system's lifespan. So obviously this is the Game Boy Pocket with some of the interesting advertisements. I love this one, Ononoko Date Game Boy. So basically saying that even though it's I'm a girl, I'm basically all about the Game Boy. It's roughly what that's saying. It's a bit hard to sometimes translate Japanese directly into English, because if you did, it wouldn't really quite make sense. But we've got the Game Boy Light there, and then the Game Boy Color. So some really detailed information, and then it goes into how the Game Boy Color changed the hardware. Basically we've got different link cable, port specifications, the processor, speed differences and so forth, as well as how the colouring worked. And then such a really comprehensive list of all the accessories, both first and third party, which is interesting. Yeah, it's just so detailed. It really, I can't lie to you, I didn't read all of this yet because that's the bit I'm going to talk about in just a moment. But then the catalogue itself is just wonderful. I mean, essentially, if we go to, say, for example, you've even got the Super Game Boy there. If we go to the 1989 releases for Japan, you can see that we've got screenshots, we've got a picture of the box art, as well as what genre it is, the publisher, the date it was released, and the list price including tax. But yeah, it's really comprehensive, and this is extremely useful when you're sort of looking for particular Game Boy games to get a bit of an idea of what the box might look like. Sadly, not a picture of the cartridge itself. That would possibly be more useful to me, but overall it's very interesting. It doesn't tend to do so much in a way of critically reviewing the games. It's more about what the game is rather than whether it's a good one of it. For example, this one here, I think this is Hiroshugo Pinball Party. I think that's how you read that. Which is a Jalico pinball game. It's rubbish. You're much better off with Revenge of the Gator or Rokuju Roku Biki Wani I forget the name of it in Japanese now, but Parade of the 66 Alligators, isn't it? So Kyushin, something like, or Koshin, Daikoshin. I can't remember now. I'm not even going to try and pretend. In fact, actually, it'll be in here, won't it? Let's see. Isn't a very early game, so there it is. Yeah, Pinball Rokuju Roku Biki no Wani Dai Koshin. There you go. I got there in the end, didn't I? So it's a really comprehensive guide, and then, as I said, it also goes into all of the non-Japanese released titles. So for example, here we're at 1990, so 1989. So this is all of the overseas catalogue here, starting in 1989 and making its way through. This also includes EU exclusives, of which there are some, and also North American exclusives that basically only existed in one region. So this is really useful because there are a lot of games that never were released for the Game Boy in Japan, and the way that it designates is that if you look here, for example, you've got the listing for Gauntlet 2, you can see that it wasn't released in Japan, because if you compare this to the Choplifter 2 listing here, you can see that it's got the Japanese published title here. So yeah, you can see that Choplifter 2, or Ni, was released in Japan. So the same thing with Mysterium here. But others, like, I mean, here's Fortified Zone, recently picked that up for the Super Famicom, if you saw my recent video. But yeah, you got Ikari no Yosai there, so you can see at a glance what was released in Japan and not released in Japan, and there are a lot of really good games that weren't released over here. So sometimes if I find myself back in the UK, I can go to somewhere like CEX or maybe eBay even, because it can be a little bit limited over there, and you know, pick up a couple of the more cheaper games. Like I picked up Worms when I was over there because it's okay on the Game Boy. I quite enjoy Worms, and yeah, it's about the best way you can play it. I think the only downside to it is that obviously it doesn't save your progress. So yeah, if you turn it off whilst you're playing a game, unfortunately you're going to lose all that progress. But yeah, it's extremely complex, in depth, and yeah, you can see it also covers Game Boy Color as well, which is really useful. But there's one thing I do want to show you, which clearly the editor or the publisher or the writer of this book had a bit of fun with a game that I'm just going to find for you. I found it. Okay, so we've got Lingo here. It was only released in Europe, according to this, by Ultron. Yeah, so yeah, it's Oranda, France, Deutsch で放送したテレビ番組をゲーム化. So basically a television program that was aired in Netherlands, France and Germany. But I noticed here that they've clearly started to spell FUC. Just one letter missing. Let's have a look through here. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K. Oh look, the cursor's over the K. So there you go. But even just flicking through this, just to try and find that little screenshot. I found games that I didn't realise were released on the Game Boy. For example, just a moment ago, I saw that in the North American region, Crystalis was released for the system. I mean, how awesome is that? I don't know if it's any good on the Game Boy, but fair chances it's okay. So, yeah, there are some really cool non-Japanese exclusives as well. But now I want to talk about basically how the Game Boy here in Japan really helps me in my Japanese studies. And let me show you Seiken Densetsu on the Game Boy. Wa doku kiri da. Yeah, doku no kiri da, sorry. So basically, my point is that I'm poisoned. So this helps me reinforce my Japanese knowledge, essentially. So do I have... Yeah, I have a doku geshi. So that's basically my antidote. There we go. I use that, and there we go. So these little bite-sized chunks really help reinforce my knowledge of Japanese. I mean, that's some fairly straightforward stuff there. In a more naturalistic setting than just doing my Wanikani review, for example. So, yeah. Koko de matteru yo. Oh, mattero. I need to get my pronunciation a little bit better sometimes, so... including in English. But yeah, it's... actually, no, I want to talk to this guy here. So, these little interactions here are really useful for me learning Japanese. So, So, unfortunately, sometimes it covers up the writing a little bit too quickly. But basically, researching these little bits of text, it really helps me study Japanese. Now, I'm going to basically flip back to me actually talking at the camera, because I think I can explain this better on camera than just pointing you at this Game Boy screen. So the way that the Game Boy helps me is that any Japanese learner is going to tell you that when they first started learning the language, if they're coming from a country which doesn't use sort of Chinese characters, is that they would say that, kanji is going to be the most difficult thing. And those are the Chinese characters that were brought over to Japan many, 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 many years ago. Was it about 2,000 years or so ago? And they're very complicated, essentially. And you have to memorise the readings for these basically by brute force. And most people would say that, that was the bit that was going to be, I was not looking forward to. But then when it gets down to it and you actually start studying kanji, the thing that actually can be the hardest is actually like a full page full of hiragana or katakana. That's basically the Japanese phonetic orthography, and the reason for that is because it can be very hard to pick the bones out of looking at a complete wall of hiragana and katakana due to the very nature of the way that Japanese is punctuated. So when you see kanji in writing, it actually helps you see much more quickly at a glance what something is saying, and you can sort of see the words a lot more easily, whereas when it's all hiragana, I find that sometimes as a learner of Japanese I have to read somewhat aloud at times to be able to go like, I've got the words now. And I think it's still an important skill, because a lot of people say like, I can read hiragana, I can read katakana, but to be able to actually understand it when written in prose is something that I overlooked a bit, if I'm honest. I got to the point where I could write hiragana and katakana no problems like 4 or 5 years ago, and I could read it pretty much fluently. But when I was actually presented with some like native, like this book or on a video game or whatever, it might be a letter in the post, I couldn't do it because it's like, where's the words in this? And I find that the bite-sized chunks of the Game Boy really helps me do that. But on top of that, because of the limited resolution of like the Game Boy, it doesn't have a high resolution screen, and the limited storage of the Game Boy means that the games are predominantly in hiragana and katakana. And so we'll often use various sort of writing techniques in Japanese to fit it on screen, essentially. So a good example of this is so-called zuke. I've learned about this in the past, but I've obviously forgotten about it. And I got to this point where I'm just like, why do all these characters seem to end these verbs using zu? And so I looked it up to remind myself. And of course, it's the negative form, the naike, as it would be called in Japanese. So, for example, wasare nai became wasare zu. So it's just classical Japanese. It's old-fashioned Japanese to basically mean like don't forget in this case. Wasurenai, wasurezu, don't forget. That's basically been really helpful to me because it's reinforced points that I have overlooked, and now because I've learned it in context, I'm always going to remember it because that's the way that my brain works. You know, yes, I do study with traditional or semi-traditional materials like drilling exercises, textbooks and worksheets and going to a Japanese class, but the way that I learn best is by practice, which is probably why my spoken Japanese is somewhat better than my reading ability, if I'm honest. So because I hear stuff and I just repeat, I parrot. A really good example of this was at my local skate park that I go to, which I'm actually going to after recording this video. I bought some new bushings for my skateboard truck, so I wanted some soft bushings, and the owner said to me, I don't know how to explain this, but in Japanese I would say, Jikan ga tattara kono bushin ga najimu. Okay, I'm like, eh? And then we began to pick the bones out of what he was saying. Because he likes me to speak English with him because he wants to practice his English. But it works both ways, that sometimes I'm just like, please explain this to me in Japanese. And I knew that in this case, the verb that he was using, tatsu, basically is to say to pass. But it can mean also, when you connect it to a noun like jikan, which means time, it basically, when time passes, jikan ga tattara, okay, kono bushin, these bushings, they will break in, najimu. Najimu is the Japanese verb to break in, or to, basically to break in. It probably has a slightly better definition than that, but in that context, that's what it means. And so through that, physical experience, that phrase will never leave my mind now. Now, I can count probably on one hand how many times I'm going to need to say that in real life, and I've probably used 3 of those opportunities already in this video. But the point is, it reinforces the structure of the grammar and the way that I can use this, and also puts the more important verb, tatsu in this case, which is to pass, not to stand. Unfortunately, that is one of the issues with Japanese. You get a lot of words that sound the same but different meanings. Basically, it allows me to see the use of that verb in actual real life context, which my brain will now just swap in different contexts around it, and I'll be able to, sort of use this in other situations. So, for example, jikan ga tattara watashi no ryoko wa totemo tanoshikatta. As time passed, my travel was great fun. I don't know how else I can say something like, jikan ga tattara, watashi no nihongo wo chotto narete ikimasu. As time passes, I become more used to Japanese kind of thing. So that's why these bite-sized chunks are really useful. And it also throws up things that I'm just never finding in the manga or in the books that I read. There was one bit in Seiken Densetsu, which I can't show unfortunately because I've already passed that point in my save file. But you basically get thrown from Julius's airship and you land on top of Amanda's cottage, and sort of like you're rescued or you're resting in her cottage. And there was one phrase where it said something along the lines of Buji ni nige nobiru. Yeah, buji ni nige nobiru. And I'm like, what the hell does this mean? And I know that buji ni means like safe and sound. Like, for example, if I was saying to one of my friends, oh, buji ni kaeta, I returned home safe and sound, is essentially what I'm saying there. So I know buji ni, so I'm like, there's something about being safe and sound, and I thought, I'm sure nige is like the stem of nigeru, which is to flee or to run from. So, like, for example, during a natural disaster, you would like, nige, nigete, nigero, like flee, get out kind of thing. But I didn't quite know what this nobiru was. Not noboru, which is to climb, but nobiru. So I managed to look it up and I found it, and it basically means to escape without harm, or to evade capture in a way, or to essentially get away or make good of your escape, essentially is what it was saying. I'm just like, I would never have learnt that elsewhere. And so having these little bite-sized bits of text, which can sometimes seem a bit impenetrable because they're written using some slang, they sometimes drop the odd hiragana because it's mimicking conversation, is actually really good for me, because sometimes I will hear this in conversation. Okay, maybe Buji ni nige nobiru is something that's unlikely to come up unless I join a Yakuza and, you know, rob a bank or, you know, do some kind of nefarious thing which I need to escape from, you know, safe and sound. But it's really expanding my understanding of the Japanese language in a fun and vital way, and I think it's so important when you learn any language to not just use your standard study materials but to have stuff that you really enjoy. And you know, I love the Game Boy. It's something that has such a special place in my heart and always will do, and I really hope that my Game Boys just keep going over the years, because I know that it's going to take me forever and a day to get through all of these games, which I'll be showing many of them on Saki Endo's Rubbish Heap, which is coming in June. I'm really excited about that channel, so please do subscribe to it. And if you like what I do, my patrons have been instrumental in really helping me keep my channel going over the years, and so if you want to join, you can join for free. I occasionally put some stuff out for free on there. It's not just paid stuff, but for those of you who want to chip in a couple of dollars a month to help support the channel and, you know, make my life here in Japan sustainable, that would be really appreciated. And for some of the tiers, I send out a postcard once or twice a year, depending on your tier, with some original artwork and lots and lots of exclusive content. I'm extremely active over there. But yeah, the Game Boy, it all started from buttboarding down Arlington Terrace in 1989, and my good friend Rachel, and our times at school, and finding one of our classmates' Game Boy, and from that I was able to piece together when it was I got my Commodore 64, and essentially my love of video gaming came into my life. And wow, I'm nearly 41, and yeah, it's pretty rad really, isn't it, when you think about it? So yeah, I think that's about it for this video. Happy birthday, Game Boy. May you always be awesome. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there because I really want to get off to Matsusaka, and I really want to get skating. Want to practice my 5-0 to fakie today, which is going really well. Got that down really well, you know, like, you know, 5-0 stall to, you know, basically pivoting back in and all this rad stuff. So yeah, life is awesome, isn't it? So it's all about how you look at things, isn't it? So happy birthday, Game Boy. You've been awesome. Anyway, that's all for this one. I hope to see you in another one of these, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.